Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rahul Bansod, and I am a research intern at Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of ICS Wednesday seminar titled Hobson's Choice, the US and China after the next election. For the past 8 years, US-China relations have been marked by high tariffs, recriminations, and growing arms race between these two countries. The Biden administration, still there till January 2025, has carried out policy of challenge, competition, and cooperation, while Trump has spoken about higher tariffs and more aggressive policy towards China. It is not clear what Kamala Harris' posture will be. Will a different policy be espoused, or will it be a continuation of the Biden approach? And what can be China's options? These questions will be the focus of today's discussion. The speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Amit Gupta, who is a senior advisor to the Forum of Federation, Ottawa, Canada, and has also served as the faculty of the Department of International Security at the US Air Force Air War College, Maxwell AFB. Dr. Gupta has authored two books, namely Building an Arsenal, The Evolution of Regional Power Force Structure, and Global Security Watch, India. He has also edited several books, including India's Nuclear Security and Air Force, The Next Generation. In the realm of popular culture, he has written in an academic journal and magazines and featured in Doctor Who, The Defenders, Star Trek, International Cricket, and the Globalization of Sports. Dr. Gupta received his education at the University of Delhi and the Australian National University and holds a doctoral degree from the University of Illinois. In his spare time, he has coached the Air War College soccer team for the Jim Thorpe Inter-Services Competition at Army War College, Pennsylvania. The chair for today's seminar is Professor Alka Acharya. She is a professor and chairperson at the Center of East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and honorary director of ICS. She has also been a full-time director and a senior fellow of the ICS. Professor Acharya has also served as the editor of Quarterly Journal China Report. She was nominated by Government of India as the member of India-China Eminent Persons Group from 2006 to 2008 and was a member of National Security Advisory Board of Government of India for 2 terms. Her recent publication is Boundaries and Borderlands, a century after 1914 Simla Convention, published by Routledge in 2023. And her current research focuses on India-China-Russia trilateral cooperation. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. It is requested to keep the questions short. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand it over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Acharya. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul. So it is a matter of great pleasure to welcome Amit once again to the ICS platform. We've had him at regular intervals over the last many years. In fact, he has enlightened us quite a few times about issues pertaining to China and the United States. And he brings a very refreshing perspective, not just from the American point of view, but his vantage point actually is India watching China and the US. There's a minor correction, Rahul, in the bio. He's not University of Delhi. Very much a JNU product, after which he went to Australia, and of course, after that, globe-trotted his way down to Canada currently. But he's in many places at the same time. Now, what we had a discussion before we finalized this topic, and essentially, my question to Amit was that the Hobson choice is not just about China's dilemma, really. It's, I would say that between Trump and Biden, now Harris, fairly large number of countries are actually thinking about this in a Hobson choice kind of fashion. But when it comes to China, the dilemma is particularly acute. And it seems to me, and this is the question I put to him, that was it the case that this was not exactly about China having similar opinions about both, in the sense that either was a disaster, or if the Sino-American relationship was fast getting beyond what is called a redemption or a tipping point, as Lambton once said, that the question was irrelevant. So do we have a Hobson's choice, or whether it does not matter whether it is Trump or Harris? There is a lot of writing that has been coming out on the ICS platform, which is bringing out the Chinese perspectives. Recently, one of our honorary fellows, Hemant, wrote a very interesting piece about the Chinese debates on this forthcoming election, in which he quoted a Chinese scholar from Bhutan, I think Zhang Hao, who used this phrase that both were two bowls of poison. So, that would bring out the Hobson's choice flavor. But on the other hand, that article by Hemant also points to the fact that there is a serious divide within China, which is that it's not really quite clear as to how the establishment, particularly within the government, is really assessing its options. And he suggests that there is a serious ideological divide among the Chinese intellectuals, which would mean that there is also some kind of a divide within the establishment. Now, finally, I would say that the Hobson's choice is also about the politics and the economics, as it were. That if Trump represents a return, and a recent statement says that he's planning to up the tariff to about 60%, then obviously the Chinese are looking at a very serious problem. So how do they assess the return of Trump and the return of tariffs, and really the choices just going haywire, or the Democratic government coming in and they taking up where they left off as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, which means greater strategic contestation as far as Asia is concerned. So is it really this kind of a choice that China faces, and how do you look at this difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of what is the choice that China has been presented with? So I'll stop there and ask Amit to take the floor and wind us through this dilemma, Xi Jinping's dilemma, Hobson's choice. Okay, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alka. I've learned in life that I'm a recidivist because I keep going back to do the same thing over and over. One of them is to talk to the ICS, and it's always a genuine pleasure to do so. It's about 6:10 your time, so I'm setting my alarm for 35 minutes, and I will try and cover as much as I can, and then we can go to the Q&A. Look, the poison, in order to understand why both options are poison, you really have to understand where the United States stands today. And several things are there. Some have come about in the last 5 to 10 years. Some have been there for a long, long time. So the first thing that has changed quite dramatically in the United States is there is a bipartisan consensus on China now. And that bipartisan consensus is essentially that we must maintain unipolarity. Nobody in America, no American politician can go to the American public and say, we are moving towards multipolarity or bipolarity. Because if you look at the 4 legs good, 2 legs bad kind of sloganeering of Trump, what does Make America Great Again say? You can't be great again if you are one of 6 or 7 different poles. And Biden and his Vice President Kamala Harris have in no shape or form suggested that they want to be in a multipolar world. So unipolarity is the first thing. So maintaining unipolarity limits your choices. And it also limits how you can behave with China. The second part about maintaining unipolarity is that there are three strategic challenges to unipolarity as far as the United States is concerned. The first is Russia, the second is China, the third is the Middle East. And the point I've made repeatedly is you can do 1 out of 3, you can't do 3 out of 3. The problem for the United States is from the days of George Walker Bush Jr., it has tried to make China the focus of American strategic competition. What happened? Bush tried in January or February of 2001 to make China the strategic competitor, spent the next 8 years of his presidency doing wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. In comes Obama, who says, I want to do a pivot to Asia. And he goes right back into the Middle East. And he's starting to do Arab Spring and clean up all kinds of messes. Trump manages to change it because despite the lazy intellectualism of the Pentagon and the State Department, who like to think of Russia as the enemy because that's an easy enemy to counter. They build a tank, America builds a tank. They build an airplane, America builds an airplane. China's more difficult. But what Trump did was he said, put Russia on the back burner. So did Obama, by the way. Obama called Russia a regional power, which nobody in the Pentagon liked because you don't have to build weapons against regional powers. But what Trump does is he says, put it on the back burner, have the Abraham Accords for the Middle East, and let's focus on China. And he comes out with a set of fairly aggressive measures, starting with high tariffs, rearming Taiwan, and then pushing towards making China take a technological step backwards. Okay? So this is the overall context. And in comes the Biden administration, and it doesn't change anything. The tariffs remain. They try to keep graduate students out of sensitive programs in American universities. And very much like Trump, they buckle down on corporations like Huawei to make sure that they do not achieve technological leaps. So that's the second thing. The third thing that you've got to remember about the Americans, and this nobody in New Delhi seems to understand, and I kind of go and tear what's left of my hair out every time I give a talk on this. America has two strategic partnerships, Britain and Israel. Everybody else is one tier below that. And I want everybody in New Delhi to remember this. When there were the Mumbai terror attacks and 166 Indians were killed by India's friendly neighbor to the west, the American government told the Indian government to exercise restraint. Well, this terror attack in Israel, have the Israelis been told to exercise restraint? No. On the contrary, you have so-called respectable politicians in America like Lindsey Olin Graham saying, use whatever you need, even nuclear weapons, to finish the job. And then there is Namrata Randhava, who goes by the alias Nikki Haley, who writes on artillery shells, finish them. Now, the level of barbarianism in this, I cannot even begin to fathom. But it's Israel. And very few other countries in the world get that kind of support from the American government. Below the strategic partnerships are what I call the white people who drink beer. You look at any white country in American calculations, it has a higher standing than non-white nations. Japan being the only exception, because you have to buy those clever things that the Japanese make. Well, not that much anymore, unfortunately. But look at how this plays out. There is an intelligence sharing agreement called the Five Eyes. And that Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement is the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. New Zealand's population is 4.5 million people, which makes it about 15% of the population of the national capital region of Delhi. They get better intelligence sharing than India does from the United States. This is the hierarchy of how foreign policy is determined in the world-famous State Department. And it needs to be understood in India. Also remember, when the Canadian Prime Minister accused India of carrying out assassinations in Canada, the US government supported the Canadians. It didn't say India, a great Quad partner, going to take on China, etc., etc. It said, no, we'll go with the Canadians on this one. So this is the mindset in which the strategic competition between the United States and China is carried out. Now, what has changed in the United States since the times of Barack Obama? Obama sat and said, maybe we can work with bipolarity. Maybe we can make the Chinese into stakeholders. And by the way, this was something that Henry Paulson, George Bush's Treasury Secretary, also wrote in his memoirs, because he said at the end of the day, you need the Chinese to stabilize the world economy. You need them to help with tricky places like North Korea, and you need them to help control things like environmental change, so on. That's gone out of the window. Bipolarity is not an option. Power sharing is not an option. What you see from both Democratic analysts and Republican analysts is very clearly this: we have to win. So this is really being put in Cold War terms. Okay? Second thing is, why do you have to win? And you have to win because there's a real fear that the Chinese will economically, technologically surpass the United States. And within Asia, which is increasingly the area where the Americans realize everybody's economic bread is buttered, the Chinese exercise hegemony. Now, do keep this in mind, because the Europeans don't get this. If you look at the combined GDP of China, Japan, and South Korea, it is 30% higher than that of the European Union. Also, in 2023, 66% of global growth was in Asia. It wasn't in Latin America, it wasn't in Africa, it wasn't in the US and the EU. Those four continents accounted for 1/3 of global growth. This is a long-term trend which is not going to change. And I'll show you some data later on this. So what has the strategy become? The strategy has become essentially three parts. One part is challenge. And the challenge part of it is challenge the Chinese technological rise. So we saw both the Trump administration and the Biden administration buckle down on the Europeans and make countries like Italy, Germany, Britain move away from Huawei. Okay? And say that Huawei's telecommunications equipment was embedding spyware. So that led to Huawei having trouble. The second part of this was denying the Chinese the technological components they needed to move towards the next generation of electronics and so on, which is essentially put restrictions on the export of semiconductors. Okay. Another part in this lay in getting Chinese graduate students out of sensitive programs in computer science, electrical engineering, physics, you name it, out of American universities. Because the fear was they would learn something, take it back to China, and work with it. And the third part in this has been military modernization. This begins with Trump. Trump was fascinated with nuclear weapons. He gave a long interview to the New York Times where he said, oh, we can use them. And he agreed to spend about $500 billion at the rate of about $49 billion a year to modernize the American nuclear forces to have sort of lower yield nuclear weapons, which could be used against hardened Chinese targets. Nobody was talking Russia at that point of time. They were talking When Trump drew this up, they were talking about China. And the last part was tariffs. Now, what you have to remember is the US actually had a plan for the Asia Pacific, which was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the idea was more free trade, we'll have better labor laws, we'll have greater transparency on investments, and everybody was going to sign up on this. Eventually, Trump says, no, this works against the American worker, as does NAFTA. So Hillary Clinton jumped on it too. And then the question became, who was the bigger protectionist? And the TPP went out of the window, though it does exist in treaty form now. So these were the four components. And here's the thing, neither Trump, if he comes back, nor Harris is going to change this. And I would say this, if you look at the Harris policy, and I'll talk Trump in a second, the Harris policy can go in one of two ways. It can be Biden light or it can be Biden heavy. Biden light is, okay, we continue the tariffs, maybe reduce some of them, because Biden's Trade Secretary, Gina Raimondo, when they saw how high inflation was, said maybe we remove some of these tariffs and we lower inflation in the United States when inflation hasn't gone down. Okay? The second thing is they'll continue to militarize. Militarization is good. And partly the justification for militarization is, well, we now have the Russian threat. But it's hugely expensive also. The US is going to go up from building 550 Patriot missiles to 650. The Ukrainians have said they need 700-800 just for themselves. So that leaves out Taiwan, Israel, you name whoever, plus American requirements. This stuff is very expensive, but you'll see that happening. The other thing which I find extremely amusing, because the Trump people tried it, the Biden people tried it, is new alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And this started with the Quad, which I don't call a Quad, I call it a 3+1, because the Americans, the Japanese, and the Australians, they have the same technology, the same operational doctrines. And if you can find a Japanese officer who speaks English, you can put him on an American Aegis class destroyer and he'll know exactly what to do. That doesn't happen with the Indian Navy. It's a different kind of Navy. It's got different kind of equipment. Merging it to have sort of operational unity doesn't really happen. The other thing you have to keep in mind about both Australia and Japan is when the Americans say jump, the Australians and the Japanese say how high. The Indian response, which I tend to like, is why don't you jump first and then I'll see if I'm in the mood to do so. That doesn't lead to a quadrilateral alliance, a quadrilateral grouping. And remember, people have made fortunes out of discussing what this is. I don't take it seriously. And there are good reasons for that. Well, now they're talking about, let's bring in the Philippines. And the Quad becomes the Squad. I'm not sure why it can't be like P. Smith and the P can be silent on the Quad. But anyway, Alka got that. It is the fact of the matter is, Philippines is not a serious military entity. And you would have to spend billions of dollars to bring it to that level. I've said the same thing about India. If you want India to have that kind of seamless technology and weaponry, which can be used in a joint operation, then you have to spend about $100 billion on the Indian military modernization and give it to India as a subsidized in a form. That the Americans will never do. More on that in a second. So new alliances doesn't really work. And then let me talk about the Australians, my favorite whipping boy, who again I love dearly in New Delhi for reasons I'm never quite sure. When I used to teach in military institutions, the joke in military institutions was the Australians are good for looking after the bar. Because the Australians are very clear when they send their forces. Keep our forces out of harm's way, and what do we get in it? And the same thing has happened with AUKUS, which I was told in Delhi is the elephant in the room. I'm like, nah, not really the elephant, more like the mosquito in the room. And let's be clear why. The Australians said, yes, we want nuclear submarines, but we're not going to go and fight in Taiwan. Well, then you're going to use it to do circles of Australia, which I'm sure will go down very well with the Australian public, but I'm not sure what the military utility of this is. So if you're talking military alliances, you need to learn a bit more about what the dynamics are in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll come to NATO in a second. Okay, there's also Biden heavy, which is you substantially increase military expenditure, which I don't think you can. You really invest in the American Navy and the Air Force. Actually go back to what the US Navy was talking about, which is a 300 ship Navy, which is again very expensive to do, and give Taiwan the kind of weapons it wants. But then that leads to real challenges with Beijing. Okay, what is Trump saying? The 60% tariffs. The nice thing about Trump is it's how much of this is policy and how much of this is stream of consciousness. It's Wednesday, so I happen to be in the mood, so let's say 60%. The actual concrete policy will be tariffs, higher tariffs, because the man he has who's talking about this is very serious about trying to put the brakes on what they think are unfair Chinese trade practices. The second thing is they're talking seriously about decoupling the economy. There's the Vietnam option, so on. And of course, Trump is going to boost military expenditure because in the United States, that's the one sector of the economy that you can pump money into and you immediately see higher growth levels. So, but the question is, are they worried about going to war? And what's happened over the last 6 to 8 years is quite simply the number of incidents between the United States military and the Chinese military continue to go up. And the real fear is some issue, some place where people shoot at each other becomes a flashpoint and triggers something bigger. I don't think it'll trigger something bigger, but it will create panic across the world, especially on the stock markets and so on. So that is there. Now, all this is very good, but my own sense is if China has a Hobson's choice here, that neither alternative is very good, or as Alka pointed out, it's poison. What is the American alternative? And the American alternative is Hobson's choice as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to now open my slides here for you, and just going to hit share. All right, did it come up? Can you see it? Oh yeah, it says you can now see. All right, I'm going to put this into slideshow so it's easier for you guys to see it from current slide. Okay, here's the problem. People do not realize how much money the United States is spending on defense now. The defense budget for fiscal year 2025, which begins in October, is $849 billion. Add to this the $49 billion for nuclear modernization. Now you're already close to $900 billion. And then add the supplementals, which nobody knows what they are right now, which is how much money has been spent on defending Israel and how much money was spent on taking on the Houthis in the Red Sea. And just to give you one idea on the cost of Gaza, when the Iranians did their sound and light show over Israel, the Israelis claimed to have spent $1.3 billion in using air defenses and so on. There is an estimate that came out of MIT, which said between the Americans, the British, and other allies, 154 aircraft were put up, and about $2 to $2.5 billion was spent shooting down Iranian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, etc. So the actual number is closer to $3.5 billion and counting. Okay. Add to this one more thing, and this is the American Veterans Administration budget. Now, in India, as you all know, and actually one can say in most countries in the world, people don't cheat. The defense budget includes pensions and medical care for servicemen. If you look at this is the last 6 or 7 years of the Veterans Administration budget. It goes from $197 billion in 2018 to $325 billion. It's been growing at about 10% a year. And the second set of data is how much of that is medical costs for the 50,000 plus soldiers who came back wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you can see, that's almost doubled in 6 to 7 years. I estimate this figure to go close to 500 billion before it's all over. And it'll be the second highest amount in the American budget. Now, what that means in real terms is, just so you know, the American defense budget is already over $1.2 trillion. And the question we all have to ask is, how much more can you afford in your Hobson's choice of taking on the Chinese? Then you have the allies. And after Ukraine happened, there were two chants coming out of the sheep in Europe. One was NATO is back. The second is the EU is back. Well, here, take a look at this. These are the four serious militaries in Europe: Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. I'm not including people like Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, so on. I mean, nice scenic places, but very little military competence. Or Portugal, who gave gave 3 Leopard tanks to the Ukrainians for their war effort. Okay? And Ukraine is bigger than Germany. But if you look at these numbers, guys, notice one thing. Everybody's army shrinks. Everybody's number of aircraft shrink. And I'll just give you 2 data points here. The Ukrainian official figure is we lost 31,000 dead in the war so far. That was in January this year. That number, the official number, has presumably gone up. Now, if the British Army is close to 80,000 people, can they take 31,000 deaths? And we're not including casualties, which is how many people got wounded. Can the French take 31,000? Can the Germans take 31,000? Can the Italians take 31,000? The answer is no. And if you look at the Germans, there's 235 aircraft. Only about 120 of them were actually flying. The rest were in mothballs. And when Olaf Scholz said, I want to spend money on rebuilding the German military, he was talking about bringing it from 120 aircraft to 235 aircraft. He wasn't talking about going back to Cold War levels. And I gave a talk 5 years ago in the Pentagon, and I asked this German Major General who was attending it, how many tanks out of your 311 Leopard tanks are operational? He said 95. 13 were given to Ukraine and blown up. These people do not have the capacity to launch a war beyond the borders of Europe. And even within Europe, as you can see from the numbers, without the Americans, they're dead. And when the Queen Elizabeth II, that beautiful aircraft carrier, went around the world, it had Royal Air Force F-35s on it. And the point I always make is no self-respecting Navy takes Air Force aeroplanes on its vessels. Go ask Admiral Tripathi of the Indian Navy if he'll take Indian Air Force Rafales on Vikramaditya, and he'll say, I would probably jump off the bridge of Vikramaditya before I allowed that to happen. But this is what the British had to do. And the thing is, the Royal Air Force had to pull them out because it needed them for operations to defend Europe. So essentially 2/3 of the airplanes on this ship were taken off. Long story short, put together, where are the allies who are going to help you fight this war? And remember one thing, the whole of Europe is in serious demographic decline, number one. Number two, they don't want to fight. In the last 2 years, I've given lectures in Britain. I don't call it great because that's pretentious. Netherlands, Belgium, and Portugal. And in all of them, I asked this question: how many of you are willing to put on a uniform and go to Ukraine and fight and die to resist Father Putin? And the answer was 0. No young person wanted to go. And do keep this in mind, guys. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 43. War is a young person's game. It's not an old person's game. And the Taiwanese need to know this too. I'll talk about that if you like later. So this is the thing. There's also an economic side to this that I want you to keep in mind. And these were the major holders of US Treasury bills in 2018. As you can see, the Chinese were at 1.1 trillion. The Japanese had 1 trillion. Brazil was at 317 billion. This is May of 2024. And for those who say, well, he hasn't given the data from August 2024, that's because it comes out in quarters. The August one will come out in September. Look at what happens. The Japanese are marginally higher. The Chinese shrink by about $400 billion. The Chinese are de-risking. They're pulling money out. Belgium, which had significantly higher levels of investments in America, they've also reduced their numbers because some of that is Chinese money. The Chinese are pulling out for one very simple reason. They're worried about whether their assets would be frozen in any kind of Cold War. Also, you need it to support the Chinese economy, okay? So that aspect of it is there. The other part is all this talk of decoupling, etc. This is Chinese trading partners in 2023. ASEAN in 2022 was about 800 billion or 830 billion. It's up to 911 billion. The EU, despite all the talk of decoupling, let's put 38.1% tariffs on electric vehicles are at 794. The US, which used to be at 700 billion, is at 680. And then everybody else is more or less in the same. The interesting one in this is Russia. Russia was not in the list of top 10 trading partners. It's traded about 240 billion with the Chinese. The Chinese are also understanding you need to decouple. They're looking at the Asian option. They're looking at options across the world. They're looking at the BRICS. So that part of it is there. Okay, and where does this come? The Xi-Biden meeting depends on how you want to look at it. Some people were overjoyed. Some people said, well, they both agreed to talk to each other. What came out of it? There were very low-level achievements. Number one was the Chinese agreed to stem the flow of fentanyl chemicals to the United States, which come through Mexico, which is a big thing because if you live in the part of America I live in, drug addiction on fentanyl is huge. The second thing is they decided to reopen military-to-military dialogue. The third one, which, by the way, the Russians and the Chinese are both talking very seriously with the Americans, is a dialogue on the risk of artificial intelligence. And why is this important? One of the things that all three countries are talking about is under no circumstances should you put artificial intelligence in charge of the employment of conventional weaponry, but most particularly nuclear weaponry. And lastly, they talk about things like, well, let's increase direct flights and so on. Okay, that's what I wanted to give in terms of the American Hobson's choice. Where does this end or where does this go? It's a Cold War. I mean, there's no other way of describing this. It talks like a Cold War, it walks like a Cold War. This has become a Cold War, but it's not the Americans and the Russians. You still need a lot of consumer goods from China. You need all kinds of other goods from China. It's also Hobson's choice because this Vietnam option is a joke. Anybody who seriously studies Vietnam will tell you Vietnam has two problems. One, they do not have the kind of managerial capacity of middle managers that the Chinese have that you need to do production, just as India doesn't. Look at why every Indian industry is saying, please give visas to Chinese middle managers. The second thing is Vietnam has serious problems with power. It looks like New Delhi in the 1970s in that sense. People who are putting money into Vietnam are pulling money out of Vietnam. And looking for alternatives when you talk decoupling is difficult. The Chinese are also being smart because they realize that Europe is a place to go. So they are going after the low-hanging fruit in Europe. They put a lot of money into the big countries, which is Britain, Germany, Italy, and France. But now they're putting money into Hungary because they told one of my favorite politicians, Viktor Orban, we will make Hungary the electric vehicle hub of Europe. And the problem is, as an EU member, you can't say, oh, you've got a Chinese factory working there. You can't send it to the rest of EU. And you can't charge those 38.1 tariffs. And you have to be an idiotic bureaucrat in Brussels to come up with the decimal point in the tariff rate, but then again, they get much better salaries than I ever did. Now, how does one conclude this? Stop thinking in terms of somehow you'll get this enlightened leader coming in the United States or in China or anywhere else who can shape international affairs. The last one who did that in America was Richard Nixon. And that's a long time ago. 90% of the people who are watching this talk weren't born then. There are structural forces in America and there are structural forces in China which will not allow this to go into a situation where on the American side, you agree with bipolarity, multipolarity. On the Chinese side, you say, we are going to restrict our technological growth. And remember, Xi Jinping says by 2035, we're going to be a rich country. That's not that far away. That's what, 11 years away? So they are working very seriously towards this. My own sense, and I'll end with this, is watch Asia grow. And watch a lot of these people who I refer to as the iron chocolate, because on the outside, they look like they're steel. Inside, they're like a chocolate bar. The Europeans, the Australians, even the Japanese say, at the end of the day, we may have to talk seriously to the Chinese. And the last time I was in the Netherlands, I was talking to a Dutch diplomat. He said, yeah, we're beginning to realize that this may have to happen. So to end, economic multipolarity is already there. Political multipolarity is also coming because, face facts, 35 countries abstained in the General Assembly in the vote against Ukraine. And that was 4.4 billion of the global population. And on Gaza, that American resolution which condemned Hamas went nowhere. Instead, Jordan's resolution, which called for a ceasefire without condemning Hamas, got 122 votes. And I have to say, India courageously abstained. You should be very proud of that. Good for you. Okay, I'll end with that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. I think that was really, really very, very thoughtful. It seems to me, on the whole, what you've said is really that the thing is all about the economy. And if we go on the basis of the kind of data that you put out, the political stroke, security stroke, strategic kind of options are really just there as a kind of prop, because they are telling, the numbers are telling a very different story. They are talking about the real restraint or constraints that the West collectively faces, but of course the United States, in terms of upping the ante with the Chinese as far as security aspect is concerned. So I think then we come back to the economy. Now, there again, I would say that what you seemed to suggest was that it was pretty much of a Hobson's choice also, because if we are not looking at any significant shift in terms of either the Republicans or the Democrats in that overall kind of framework, then the real wheels are moving on the basis of how they are able to conserve themselves in economic terms against this growth story that is happening, and to what extent can they have a place in this entire share. Here, it's quite obvious that where the Americans are also losing the plot is in the way in which China and increasingly Russia, in tow, as it were, are taking charge of this very clumsy kind of a formulation, but the global south. So you do have more and more countries gravitating towards the kind of frameworks that the Chinese are putting out there. And it's all a very different narrative from what the Americans are saying. So it's getting traction, it's getting votes, it's getting support. And as you said, that the resolution on Jordan, was it, resolution got the maximum number of votes. So the story here is that this is going to be about which country has more staying power in the kind of economic contest that is emerging. And what you're saying really is that the deeper pockets are out here in Asia.
Yeah.
So whether, and this is a question that I'd like you to come back to, so I'm just putting it out there, whether the West collectively can actually pull up its socks and try and evolve. So Cold War on the one hand, but then can they evolve strategies to re-engage in a way that benefits these countries in the global south who are seeing going with the Chinese as likely to give them more benefits than staying on there. So while they will not make any hard choices, they're going to be voting with their pockets. And so, in a sense, are we also, so that's the second part, the other side of the question, are we then looking at this Cold War actually taking us back to bipolarity? That will we see countries making more choices and taking us, in a sense, on a structural shift backwards? So I don't therefore see the logic of your argument taking us to economic multipolarity or political, economic maybe, but political multipolarity. So that's just an open-ended question, but we can leave that for now and see if there are other questions. We can take this as it were, wrap it up.
There's one in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, so Rahul, will you just see what is there in terms of...
Sure, Professor. Mr. Ashutosh has a question that what is India's position regarding the ongoing tensions between US and China, and how can it be effectively navigate the current global situation to its advantage?
Okay. There's this love affair in New Delhi with Trump, and then there's this love affair in New Delhi with the United States. But I'm going to just remind everybody here of 2 or 3 things which should give you an idea of where the India-US relationship stands. When Galwan happened, Trump was the president. And Trump didn't say, I strongly support India, those evil, perfidious Chinese took Indian land. He said, I would be happy to mediate. Now, for those people who don't know what the word mediate means, it says, I'm willing to adopt a neutral position to help you resolve your problems. That is not somebody who's saying, I'm tattooing I heart India on my backside. And if he did that I would pay good money to see. But this is the reality with Trump. He will go where the money is. Now come to Biden. Biden is the guy who's accused you of trying to carry out assassinations in the United States. Biden is the guy who said India is a xenophobic country, which I find hilarious given what Trump talks about when he talks about the US border. And despite all this stuff that people talk about, where is this great technology that you're getting from the US? The fact of the matter is you're not going to get the latest stuff. Everybody's jumping up and down on the F404 engine. The F404 engine is a 1970s, 1980s engine. So congratulations, you got the engine to the Maruti 800. Good for you. The fact is the Americans do not see you in the same way as they see other allies. And remember what they've done with the Ukrainians. They're allowing American missiles and NATO missiles to be fired from Russian aircraft. Ask them if you will allow the Indian Air Force to fire American missiles from its Sukhois. And the answer is straightway no. Okay. Forget the romance then. What is the alternative? And the alternative came in the Finance Ministry Economic Survey of India, which is the brainchild of Saktikanto Das and Nirmala Sitharaman, where they say We need Chinese foreign direct investment. We need to jump onto the China plus one strategy like Vietnam has done. We need Chinese middle managers. My argument to all of you is this. There are great things that you can get from the United States. You can improve your education system, which is in shambolic. You can improve health. You can improve tourism. You can improve wellness. You can improve the automobile industry. There's a whole bunch of things in Make in India, apart from defense, where the Americans would come in and do wonders for the Indian economy. I think that's where you work with the Americans. Okay? The Obama administration had signed an agreement for 200 community colleges in India, that's polytechnics, to make plumbers, carpenters, electricians, so on. That is what you need in India because those are the people who get self-employed. Those are the people who hire 5, 6, 10 people to work for them. That's how you create employment in India. Where do you need the Chinese? You need the Chinese for trade. You need the Chinese to develop your economy. You need the Chinese for foreign direct investment. So I'm going to say, if there is a thawing of relations between India and China, and it seems like the temperature has come down a bit, push towards increased foreign investment, push towards increased collaboration on technology, economy, so on. And just one thing on this, there's a hilarious assumption that Indian public opinion is anti-Chinese. Well, here's the thing, guys. Okay, every time I travel on the Indian metro, there's always a young kid, Rahul's age, sitting there. So I have to have a conversation with them and I say, which cell phone should I buy? Because these people know this much better than I do. And here's my Apple 14, which is expensive and totally unnecessary. But I listen to those kids and my travel phone is a OnePlus. Okay. This is the one I put a SIM card in when I travel. 70% of India's cell phone industry is dominated by the Chinese already. And as I always say, if you're that angry with the Chinese, why don't you all throw away your cell phones and buy Lava and Micromax? No, wait a second, they don't exist anymore, do they? So this idea that somehow Indian public opinion, and this is written by people who really need to read about the role of public opinion in foreign policy. I hate to make the case for academic literacy, but what the heck? This is where you have to understand this. The Indian consumer isn't sitting there and saying the perfidy of Galwan. And last thing I'll say on China is, I don't know what the Indian game plan is. What is the political game plan? Is there some Indian politician who seriously believes the Indian military is going to march and take Aksai Chin? Is there any Indian politician who seriously believes you're going to get the land back in Galwan militarily? Or, and let's take this to the fantasy world. One morning, Xi Jinping wakes up and has an epiphany, which for a communist leader is hilarious because it's a religious experience, and calls Narendra Bhai Modi and says, Narendra Bhai, I want to apologize for how mean Mao Zedong was to you by taking Aksai Chin. And I was obviously short-sighted because my military told me to take land in Galwan. Now, if you believe that's going to happen, all I can say is you should be writing fiction. Bottom line is your choices between the United States and China have to be more in terms of practical economic interests and less in terms of we are a great power, we can work, we can contain people, so on. None of this is going to happen. And you have to understand what are the costs of containment. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Next on, we have a question from Mr. Vicky Kumar, who is a master's student at Taipei School of Economics and Political Science. He's saying that according to the survey by NCCU Election Study Center, more than 80% of Taiwanese want to maintain status quo with China. They neither want to have independence nor want to be part of China. So the question is, does US really care about Taiwan's independence, or they are just using Taiwan to counter China in Indo-Pacific?
See, I think that I went to Taiwan in 2009, which is a long, long time ago. And obviously things have changed. But I was impressed by how educated the Taiwanese are. I was impressed by the fact that they had done things like healthcare and broader social capital measures very well. But the two things you have to remember about the Taiwanese, and this will explain the 80%, and this will explain why the Americans are pushing what they're pushing. In 1995, when the Chinese fired missiles across Taiwan, 30% of the country got on planes and left. And that 30% was obviously the rich part of the country. If there is any kind of fight between the Taiwanese and the Chinese, these people will run. The other question to ask the Taiwanese, and unfortunately I see from the list of people who are watching this, we don't have a Taiwanese, is do you have the stomach to fight like the Ukrainians? Can you take 30 to 200,000 casualties, 30,000 to 200? If you can, then it's game on. Let's go for this with the Chinese. But if you're going to hop on planes and run away to Vancouver, Seattle, LA, and Sydney, where all of these people have homes, then it's a different ballgame. And somebody needs to tell this to the Taiwanese. In America, they know this. In America, the general assumption is we may have to do it. It'll be hugely expensive. And there's something they've understood from the Chinese. The Chinese have said, if we have this war, we lose. Because they're pragmatic. They don't talk in terms of we are the world's greatest power, world's greatest military. They tend to have a reality check going in this. But what they say is, can the US sustain being in the South China Seas, Taiwan, East China Seas for 60 to 70 years? And that's a completely different story because it would be hugely expensive. So my own sense to answer that question is, push comes to shove, the US would defend it, but it would be hugely expensive. And what happens to Taiwan is what happens to Ukraine. That Ukraine as a society and an economy and a demography has been finished. And I hope, therefore, it doesn't go to that extent.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Professor Acharya, we don't have questions anymore.
Okay, then he can take on the two issues that I had raised earlier.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's about deeper pockets. And you're seeing this in everything that is happening around the world. I mean, the other area I work on is sports and politics. So let me bring an analogy from there for your audience. Qatar 2022 World Cup happened. The Qataris spent $200 billion. Well, unheard of sum. And they built mega cities, they built spectacular stadiums, they did everything. Well, we just had the Paris Olympics, in which India was cheated out of a gold medal for 100 grams, which I think should be taken to some court of arbitration somewhere. But we'll leave that aside for a minute. Then the Americans were bitching and whining about this. They said, 10 girls are sharing 2 bathrooms, and they're charging us for toilet paper because, you know, the Europeans are eco-conscious and so on. That's the difference in the amount of money you can spend now. The Australians don't want to spend on Commonwealth Games anymore. Look at the Chinese, look at the Koreans, look at the Indians who want to host the Olympics, look at the Gulf states. This is where the money is. This is where the big ideas are. Where are the big ideas coming out of the West? And that frustrates me, and I'll tell you why. If you talk to the Asian countries who are in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they all say the same thing. Open up the American economy, let our goods and services flow. And you could really build a very serious pro-American economic bloc there. Problem is, to do that, you have to tell American labor that your ideas make no sense. Biden and Trump have essentially said, we're going to put the brakes on electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are the future. But why? Because the auto industry in America wants to build cars where you have 2,500 parts instead of 30 parts, because those are more difficult to maintain. But this is like giving a subsidy to the horse and buggy industry when automobiles had come about. It makes no sense. So the deeper pockets will prevail. go and see how modernization is taking place across Asia, how people are rebuilding infrastructure, how connectivity is taking place, so on. That is the future. And then go and look at Britain, where to go 30 miles from where you are to Heathrow Airport takes you 2 hours, okay? Because the infrastructure is so poor and they don't have the money to put into it, but they can buy F-35s. I think the deeper pockets prevail because people are going to sit and say, do we want higher living standards or not? And unfortunately, the US lost the narrative. It did have the narrative on that. Can the US evolve strategies? I think it'll evolve strategies when it's pushed to evolve strategies, when it realizes that the current type of policies are not going to give you a long-term advantage. And are we going back to bipolarity? Now, that's really interesting because I think militarily, the Russians and the Chinese, and the Russians especially, are going to remove these restrictions they placed on themselves. See, people forget the Russians are actually very scrupulous about abiding with international treaties. So, for example, when the Russians sold the Kalpakam nuclear reactors to India, they said there'll be no reprocessing in India. We'll take the spent fuel back to Russia and reprocess it there. So that removes the problem of anybody having to check whether the Indians are using the spent fuel properly or not. Similarly, when they sold India BrahMos, they kept the BrahMos range at 290 miles so that it would not violate the missile technology control regime. Well, you have slapped so many, and you, I mean the international community, has slapped so many sanctions on the Russians and the Chinese that, of course, they're going to talk about alternatives. They're pushing for an alternative currency. Not sure what the Indian position on that is. They are going to push more for trade. Look at how $240 billion of Russia-China trade came about. And the third part in this is people forget that you're going to see huge transfers of global intellectual labor from Russia to China. There is a tendency in the West to think of the Russians as stupid, very Hitlerian terms. Hitler used to call the Russians Untermenschen. I look at the Russians a bit differently. Firstly, they have the largest number of chess grandmasters in the world, so they can't be stupid, okay? Second thing is, look at their literature. They have Dostoevsky, they have Tolstoy, they have Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote about imaginary cats in The Master and Margarita. Okay, they have Pushkin, though the Ukrainians claim him. These are not uncivilized, dumb people. And there's 300,000 foreign students studying in Russia. There's over 300,000, as all of you know, studying in China now. Isn't there some kind of a different economic, educational, ideational structure coming about? Now, having said that, it's not the Cold War because the two will continue to economically cooperate, trade, and so on with each other because they need each other. You can't bring back manufacturing to the United States in the way that it existed during the Cold War. So I think it's a two-level game. At one level, you see these countries saying, we can provide an alternative. At the other level, sure, let's trade. What's wrong with it? I mean, they still make the iPhone in China.
No, to that, I would just say two things. The first is that if we are looking at these kinds of issues, and surely when the policymakers are sitting down, they are putting these things on the table and they're coming to the negotiations with a fair idea of what their real bargaining power is. Who would be in a position to cut a better deal with the Chinese? Trump, because of his business acumen, or Harris. What I sense is that somewhere the Americans are aware of this, being now joined at the hip in that sense. And obviously, the entire economy, and we are talking now of the global economy, is going to be affected if this really comes to outright. dissolution. So the Chinese have already indicated that they are ready to compromise here, compromise there, take care of this, take care of that. What is going to be the American grand bargain here? Are they thinking of one, or till the elections we will just see bluster and positions?
See, I thought the Biden administration would come up with a grand bargain. It didn't. It said more of the same stuff. And I don't think the Harris administration, if that's the one that comes in, is going to come up with a grand bargain either. In fact, there's a friend of mine who looks at this as welcome to an era of high inflation. Because ever since the tariffs went down, plus there were domestic issues which were fallout of the COVID pandemic, we've had very high inflation in America. Now they claim inflation has come down. I don't see it when I go to buy food or I go to buy other items in stores. You know, this is the situation there. At some stage, though, I think what you need is you're going to need a generational transition on the United States side. And that generational transition is going to say, one, we cannot afford to have very high levels of defense expenditure. And that's going to be forced on the US. Because the real problem for the US is it can't pay the medical bills of its people anymore. It can't pay the Social Security pensions. Those are supposed to run out in 2030. And Trump has said, I'll stop charging income tax on it. And by run out, I mean, it's not that there'll be no money. It'll be that if I was being paid $100, I'll be paid $70. So, and I'll be taxed on the 70 to add insult to injury. So when you start coming towards that, you have to start making hard choices on militarization, defense expenditure, the basing of troops abroad. And the only person who talks this is Bernie Sanders. But Bernie is, sadly, a minority opinion in the US Congress. So I think it comes two things, generational change. Because remember, the young generation is very angry with what's going on in Gaza. The old generation is, I heart Israel, which, okay, that's fine. You are the product of your generation. The other thing is the young generation doesn't want to fight. The people forget that the Americans paid $20,000 to $40,000 bonuses to get people to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. They will have to pay $100,000 bonuses if it's Iran or the South China Sea. Where is this money going to come from? And you can't talk a Chinese existential threat to the United States. 9/11 was an existential threat to the US because you could go to the American people and say, today it's New York, tomorrow it's Los Angeles. And nobody was going to argue that one. But on the Chinese one, that Huawei is selling more phones than Apple, well, okay, that's not existential, okay? Or BYD is going to sell electric vehicles in Europe. Who cares? And I think that is where the transition comes. But I think in the short to medium term, 5 to 10 years, it's more of the same, which is very unfortunate. So that's my sad prognosis here. And concessions, yes, the Chinese will make some, the Americans will also make some along the way. I think some tariffs might get reduced. I don't think Trump will do 60% because what happened in the first Trump administration was he would propose things and his people would push back or backpedal. I mean, the Canadians, I was up there a few years ago when Trump was renegotiating NAFTA. And Chrétien said this, and the people I talked to said, look, when we talk to the American negotiators, they're not talking about radical changes because they understand what we have is a fundamentally decent agreement. But they want things to be changed at the margins. So you may get that kind of thing happening. The real problem is if somebody decides to seriously militarize. And you end up with somebody in Taiwan who claims independence. Even though, as your questioner said, 80% of Taiwanese want the status quo. So I say, expect this not to work out as well as you would hope it to be, and stop thinking that there's some enlightened leader Ramananda Sengupta wants to enter the waiting room. Somebody needs to let him in. Rahul? Oh, I let Ramananda in. There we go. This is the thing that I think is absolutely crucial. India needs to stop thinking that somehow, somewhere, a great leader is going to reshape international politics. International politics is based on very strong domestic constituencies, economic structures, and India doesn't fit into those. I'll just say one thing, and then I'll take your thought on this. Look, I live in Montgomery, Alabama, which is, when my friends ask me to describe Montgomery, Alabama, I say it's Porbandar, USA. It's a small town where I can live very happily. And if I want to see the opera or the orchestra, I take a flight to Boston or New York, big deal. But I don't live in a high rent area. If you go within a 150-kilometer radius of Porbandar, USA, you have 3 Confucius centers where they teach Chinese culture, Chinese language, so on. India, because the Indian government is snobbish, has put something in Harvard, and I believe they've put something in Stanford now at the Hoover Institution, that some money was given to set up some guy there. America has a 50-state foreign policy. You have to appeal to 50 states. You don't appeal to the elites, because the elites don't care. And I want the young people to know this. The annual budget of the state of Massachusetts is $46 billion. Harvard College, which is in Boston, Massachusetts, has an endowment of $40 billion. So it's almost at the annual budget of the state of Massachusetts. What are they going to do, or how impressed are they going to be if you put a Nehru chair, or nowadays, I don't know, Gowalkar chair, or whatever you want, in Harvard or MIT? They're not. You have to have a 50-state strategy, and you don't have to. Because, I mean, I was told this by Mohan Guruswamy. Oh, you went to University of Illinois. That's not a school. Harvard and Stanford are schools. I said, yeah, we are the people who invented Mosaic, which became Internet Explorer, which became Microsoft Edge. Because of us, you can have communications around the world. Oh, so what? It's that kind of closed-mindedness, blindness, and quite frankly, a lack of understanding of the United States, which leads to bad choices. Sorry, I had to give my little rant there.
Oh, no, it brings me to the last point that I would like to raise here, which comes out of the point you made regarding the domestic politics, domestic constituencies, and how they shape foreign policy. I remember a couple of years ago when you had given a talk here, you had given us a very interesting picture of the demographics and how it was the non-white Asians who are now beginning to play very significant roles in American domestic politics. And yet we have this contradiction where Trump is coming back because of this redneck, white, male, Christian, conservative kind of group, and obviously large enough to influence the outcome of elections. And then yet you have Kamala Harris, and you have Nikki Haley, and you have a lot of Indians. No, so the question here is, how are these demographics really influencing politics in a way in which we move away from that whole strongly white orientation, and therefore, to some extent, which contributes to that idea of US supremacy? How do the demographics, the new demographics, play out?
See, it's a yes and no question, unfortunately. Answer, not question. It's yes in the sense that as the country becomes browner, the interest of the young people is not towards Europe. And the Europeans don't get this. So when I show up as a faculty member of the United States Air Force Air War College, as I used to in the past, the Europeans would look and, what's the dark-skinned man with a foreign accent doing in the room? Not understanding that there is a dark-skinned man with a foreign accent called Sundar Pichai, who runs Google, and another dark-skinned man with a foreign accent called Satya Nadella, who runs Microsoft. They're trapped in the race thing. Okay. In the United States, if you look in the educational, tech, professional community, things have moved in a completely different direction. These are the people. These people look at their heritage. So Latinos look at Mexico, South America, East Asians look at across the Pacific. They're not interested. I mean, yeah, they like to go to Europe because it's the world's largest open-air museum. So once in a while, go and see those quaint, crumbling buildings. But at the end of the day, where are their ties? Where is their cuisine? Where is their culture? All this is in different direction, and you are starting to see that. Where it's not happening is if you go and look at the State Department, it's lily white. There are some people in the State Department who are Asians, but there is the story of Andy Kim, who's the representative from New Jersey, Korean American, who was taken off the North Korea negotiations at one point of time because they felt, well, a Korean shouldn't be in on it. And well, Andy probably can't speak a word of Korean. It's like Victor Cha, who's the Korean expert, who had to learn Korean because he doesn't really know Korean. This is your structures of decision-making are still dominated by the white population. The military, the fighting arm of the military is predominantly white. It's not black. That's one of the myths which has been put out there. And yeah, you know, there's one more aspect to this. The reason Trump is winning, there's two Asian American women in California. One's name is Jane June, who works at Southern California. The other is Natalie Masuoka, who works at UCLA. And they wrote a very interesting article. They looked at the data from every American election from, I think, 1948. They said in every American election from 1948 to 1920, white women in the majority voted for the Republicans. Only on two occasions, Lyndon Johnson, Barry Goldwater, and Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, did they vote for the Democrats. Otherwise, they've been persuaded by their fathers, their brothers, the crazy Uncle Glenn, who you wouldn't leave alone in the room with the family dog. These people have said, vote for the Republicans. It's in our economic, political interests. So this kind of thing is there. And 2020 elections, 52% of white women voted for Trump, despite the fact that the Supreme Court was stacked in another way. And now, despite all the talk about abortions and so on, why is Trump still doing so well? And remember, we still have, what, 10 weeks for the election. So who knows which way this one goes. So to answer your question, I think the demographics are going to take another 10 to 15 years to kick in. But one thing you are seeing is more and more people of color in Congress. And they are the progressive voices in Congress. So it'll be interesting to see as these people start maturing, as they start running for the presidency, Senate, so on, how they start to change things. I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy was an interesting character, to say the least. But as you saw, he didn't get much mileage in the Republican Party.
Well, I think if there is no more last-minute questions coming up, I think...
well, we got one from somebody called Vicky in Taipei in the chat.
I think that was asked already.
Oh, okay, that's been asked. Okay. All right, good.
So what really is now emerging, your entire narrative is really about the importance of getting both China and the Americans right as far as India is concerned. Because we understand what we need, we understand what we must do, and yet we are unable to really push those policies. I mean, the exigencies of the situation are such that the debate is still fundamentally about issues that are not going to get resolved in a hurry. And so, yes, the importance of looking at Sino-American dynamics is also about how the Chinese and Americans are trying to read each other and try to get each other, sense of each other. So maybe what we are making is a plea for more research, more investigations, more interactions and discussions to understand really the dynamics which are pushing foreign policy and what are the various factors. So, yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll end by saying this. I'll say two different things. With the Chinese, make it very clear we have a serious border dispute with you. But that doesn't mean that we can't trade, we can't cooperate, because ultimately the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Japanese hate each other, call each other monkey people, which we don't do, you know. But look at the amount of trade they do. And as one of my Japanese friends told me, nothing gives us greater joy than to make money off our enemies. So why not think in those terms instead of one day I'm going to march and take Aksai Chin? So that is that. And with the US, I mean, forget the military and the political, because ultimately speaking, I think India is a cheap date. India needs to say, if you want to woo me, then you need to up the game. And I said this to Sumit Ganguly, who didn't understand what I was saying. His answer was, why should America do this? But he considers himself an American. I'm like Padma Lakshmi and what's her name? Mindy Kaling, who say we are Indians, but we're also Americans. So there is none of this South Asian Indian, East Asian Indian rubbish that is being put on us in terms of our identity. But here's what I would say, and I don't think the Foreign Service can do this, by the way. One, give us permanent membership of the Security Council. Two, declare us a de facto nuclear weapons state or a de jure one under the NPT. Three, declare Pakistan a terrorist state. We'll fall in love with you. Now, which one of these do you think Trump will give you or Biden will give you? And the answer is zero. Okay. So in the meantime, go take your photographs with Biden and Kamala Harris and be happy, because that's where it sort of boils down at the end of the day. It's the bane of Facebook.
Yeah, no, I think one more thing that emerges is that the Sino-American tensions or stresses are not new, and those hoping to be able to exploit that tension to their advantage have really not gotten very far. The basic thing which now we are seeing in place is about multi-alignment or autonomy to deal with countries on the basis of your interests. I think that works. But then if you want to move on the basis of your interests, you have to go to that logical end, which is then follow the interests. So I think we're going to be watching this contest in the United States with great interest. Not only the Chinese, I think the Indians are also waiting with bated breaths to see the outcome. We may not be in as bad a position as the Chinese, but certainly we are not in a very good position either. So I think you've got some other thought coming quickly, one last line, and then we will bring this.
One last line, nobody's in a good position. Everybody's Hobson's choicing, if you want to end this the right way.
So that is precisely what I started off by saying, which was that Hobson's choice is generally, it's not just China, it's world over. People are looking at extremely difficult situations. So let's hope for things working out in a sense, better sense prevails. And thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk, and the ramifications that you brought out were really quite complex and comprehensive. So thank you very much. And Rahul, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Now I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Indeed, you have it, sir.
Thank you, Professor. So with this, we came to the end of today's seminar. We thank Dr. Amit Gupta and Professor Alkacharya for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also offer our gratitude to the audience. The video of today's discussion shall be available on ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming VSD seminar scheduled for August 21. Further information regarding the event can be found on ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. And thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.